If I was about to forget every comic story I'd ever read, but could first record a message for myself just before the mind wipe, this would be the result.
You're a wonderful man in your satin Condor Man.
Hey, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues, where I talk about my favorite DC comics of the past that are still affordably available today, blabbing about why they're special to me and what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of life. Now, warning, this series freely contains spoilers, but I think even spoiled, the stories I'll share are still well worth reading. Last time was an introduction to the series, so if you didn't see the series intro, I highly recommend checking that out just to get a sense of the intent of the series and what you can expect from it. But if you've seen that already, let's dive in. I am ready to present to you now, Peter, and anyone else that might be watching this video, my first essential DC Comics storyline, and that's Crisis on Infinite Earths. Okay, Peter, Crisis on Infinite Earths is a rare exception in this series, which will normally focus on stories that I would be happy to sit down and read again today. I only enjoyed reading this story the first one or two times that I read it, and then largely because of what a history lesson it was, not because it was this great story in and of itself, and a history lesson for a comic book universe I was already invested in. This is not an enjoyable read for me today, unlike the numerous stories that I will be talking about in future episodes of Essential Issues. So just know that this is the weird exception in this series. This is also not at all necessary to read first before diving into other stories in the DC universe, but you're going to want to read it at some point because it is just referenced and paralleled in so many major DC events in the years that followed. It features numerous characters that you won't recognize, many that have long since vanished in the DC universe, but others have been reinvented in ways that you're going to better appreciate having been exposed to them first here. You'll be able to think, oh man, this character is so cool compared to where they started out. They've been reinvented in just some interesting ways. And so this is just a nice way to get acquainted quickly with a bunch of character concepts, if not like who they are deep inside, that are in the DC universe. It's like a crash course in the character roster, both for heroes and villains throughout the DCU. And it's this multiverse-shattering, year-long crossover event that featured nearly every character in DC history up to the point it was published in 1985. I want to say it might have started in 84. I think it was maybe just throughout 85. But anyway, just accept the fact that you're going to feel way out of your depth and treat it kind of like a sci-fi movie that's just crazy weird without explaining itself, even though they really try. They really try a lot in this story to explain who everyone is. Oh man, I'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, just go into it and say it's just going to be weird, and I'm just accept that, like, I'm not going to know what's going on, and maybe there's something interesting about that. Trying to figure out what's going on and who people are. Early issues in the series are really going to be the toughest to read, as they spend time trying to introduce and include tons of obscure characters that I couldn't care less about, just to basically establish their presence in the continuity of this big event taking place. It's boring, I don't care, and there was so much that I wanted to skip when I was reading this again recently. The vast majority of art panels and text in this series are ultimately irrelevant to the story of the crisis itself. It's just a ton of characters showing up to say, hey, I'm here, I'm a part of this story, and I'm trying to help out. And that's about it. That's about all they do. It was agonizing to sit and try to read all 12 issues in one sitting. You just have to approach this as an exercise to satisfy your curiosity about a major event in DC history that is repeatedly referred back to. But as a story itself, Whew. All right, so let's start actually looking through the trade paperback of Crisis on Infinite Earths, which has been nicely recolored from the original publication, digitally recolored, and they've done a pretty nice job. The art style still looks dated, but starting just at page 11, if you're watching the podcast version of this, go to YouTube and you can watch the video version to see the images, the shots of the artwork itself. But I'm going to also just talk along so that you can follow along even if you're not watching that. So if we're looking first at page 11 in this big collection, we see an example of a more prevalent acceptance of theism, which was going on at this time, that just isn't as common today, and also familiarity with biblical ideas. You know, the opening words are, "In the beginning there was only one, a single black infinitude." So just starting with the phrase "in the beginning," it calls back to, you know, a biblical concept that most people I would say a lot of people are still familiar with today. Maybe they don't know where that phrase comes from. They just know it's kind of like this, you know, phrase that is saturated in pop culture. But anyway, so that's just one of many examples, and probably the least of them that stands out to me. There's a reference later in the series to Jonah and the whale. There's a bunch of characters using the expression, "Lord knows I tried to blah blah blah," or "Oh Lord, what are we gonna do?" Da, 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 or whatever. Like, "Oh Lord, I can't believe this is happening." You know. So, and that's just an interesting kind of bit of influence, I would say, of some form of at least the trappings of Christian culture on America that was still more common in maybe the 80s. But I can't remember the last time I heard someone, Christian or not, use the expression "Lord knows something blah 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 blah," or "Oh Lord, I can't believe blah blah," or, you know, stuff like that. So. All right, let's talk about the multiverse hypothesis, because that is really the premise, the foundational premise of this whole thing. I mean, on the first page, it says, you know, the darkness finally screamed as much in pain as in relief, and in that instant, a multiverse was born. Boom! And then you see all these fiery multiverses forming, a multiverse of worlds vibrating and replicating, and a multiverse that should have been one became many. So this is an idea that, if I remember correctly, was more popular it's in the scientific realm before this story was written, and then it just kind of eventually leaked its way down, made its way to pop culture. As is often the case, sometimes ideas that are prominent in the scientific community, they don't get to pop culture until much later, as writers of, you know, fiction and stuff hear about these things. You know, not being experts themselves, they usually pick them up from popular journals or, you know, whatever. And this was one that, like, by the time it was becoming popular, if I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, was less prevalent in scientific circles, but it's made a little bit of a comeback in recent years, so it's still very much worth talking about. The multiverse hypothesis is sometimes called on to explain how our universe could be so precisely fine-tuned for the existence of life, given just the incredible, ridiculous odds against the universe just randomly coming into being with the particular necessary values needed to permit life anywhere in the universe. Now, in science fiction, the multiverse hypothesis is used primarily for fun what-if type stories. That's how it's being used here, or in the TV series Fringe, or, you know, any number of time travel stories. But the concept involves heavy speculation and lacks observable evidence. Outside of fiction, it's largely appealed to as a sort of attempted escape route to get away from the idea that an intelligence is responsible for the fine-tuning of the universe. It's a very weak and unsubstantiated concept that's fun in sci-fi, and it does get talked about by some of the popular level talking heads from the scientific community that often are saying things about metaphysics, which really this is getting into metaphysics, not physics and observable science anymore. So it's interesting to hear talking heads, that show up on the Daily Show or wherever else, being interviewed and talking about this kind of stuff and giving it weight. It's really going outside of their area of expertise in terms of observable science. So it's a very weak and unsubstantiated concept that, again, is fun in science fiction, but it fails big time under real investigation. For more info, I've included some links below the YouTube YouTube version of this to a video and a transcript from reasonablefaith.org that are definitely worth checking out if you're interested in this particular topic. You can also take a deep dive at reasonablefaith.org by typing multiverse in the search field and combing through all the resources that show up. But for now, we're moving on. It was interesting to me that the second page in, which is page 12 in the trade paperback, Pariah says to himself, "How much longer must I suffer for my sins?" And he just, this whole page, there's kind of a vibe of him being this almost kind of prophetic type figure who's heralding, he shows up to herald the destruction of one entire universe after another, you know. And so that would just be kind of another example of this kind of like biblically influenced aspect going on in the writing at this time. If we go to page 14, there's a prime example of like, what was really hard about reading this. Ultraman, as he's trying to, you know, stop all this destruction from happening, says, "I've changed the course of mighty oceans. Don't tell me my super strength can't save my adopted planet." There is so much exposition crammed in there. So I've changed the course of mighty oceans, so that's something I've done in the past. It also says something about my strength. But just to solidify, don't tell me my super strength, which is italicized, can't save my adopted planet. Oh, so he's also from another planet. He's not a human. He's come here from... I mean, there's so many instances of this crammed in exposition and people talking in the third person, you know, it's like, well, the Maid of Might is here to help out, you know, talking about herself, you know, or whatever. Oof, it's rough. But as I adjust my expectations and prepare for that kind of writing, I find the expositional style a welcome middle ground between not knowing anything about anyone and having to read a bunch of boring wiki entries, which if you really wanted to do, you could do that to familiarize yourself with a bunch of characters and concepts of the DC Universe instead of doing this. So by all means, if that sounds good to you, then knock yourself out. But you're going to appreciate, Pater, so many things about the DC Universe more if you read this first and think of it as a highly narrative 1980s DC encyclopedia rather than compelling reading for its own sake. There is a little bit of political and philosophical theming going on in some of the writing. The Ape King Solovar, oh man, I hate talking apes and monkeys and stuff. When sentencing a murderer on page 23, he sentences him to conversion. He says, man's justice demands an eye for an eye, which he puts in quotes, but we apes need not be so barbaric. And then he sends him off to conversion, which I don't know what the crap that is, but evidently it's better than an eye for an eye, which I don't know if that's necessarily a dig against, you know, the biblical concept of an eye for an eye, which I should add was for a particular time, for a particular people in the Old Testament law. That's not something that that we are that is for us as believers to apply to life and the government, or you know, today necessarily. I also think it's interesting that he refers to that as man's justice. I think it's probably less a claim that the Bible is, you know, the invention of man, and more just kind of like an anti-death penalty statement that the writer just kind of wanted to stick in there or something. I really don't know. It's weird. The influence of this work is still resonating today, even if you look at a movie like Batman versus Superman Dawn of Justice, the moment where the Flash appears to Batman and he's like desperate to tell him something. He seems to be in big trouble and Batman doesn't know what the crap is going on. And right on page 50 we see the origin of that visual where the Flash just appears out of nowhere, and he first appears to Batman and he just seems to be in a desperate situation saying, help me, you know, and Batman doesn't know what the heck is going on. And so that's kind of like an iconic visual that has still been repeated. It's repeated in later stories. Every time there's kind of a crisis going on in the DC universe, like a big, huge event, there very often is the Flash is playing a major role. So that all started here. The visual design for the big bad, the Anti-Monitor, still holds up really well for me. It's just kind of a creepy, almost like a weird zombie type vibe, but I'm sure it was influenced by Darth Vader, this kind of like look of someone who's decaying and dying, but also surrounded by metal and technology and stuff. So yeah, it's a look that, for the most part, still holds up for me. It's just like weird and disturbing. I really like it. But here's the secret now to this series. You don't have to read almost half of it. You can just start reading about halfway through on page, I don't know, 180, 181 maybe, up through the middle of 190, because right there, halfway through this series, you get 9.5 pages that basically gives the background of the entire crisis, because it's really not explained largely up to this point. You get the origins of the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor. You get a recap of the actual story events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. You can start right here in this issue. The single issue is, I want to say, is it number 6, 5 or 6 or something like that? I can't remember. It's going to be much more expensive to get the single issues anyway, but around 180 of the trade paperback. The first 6 issues lack most of the vital info presented right here. Issues 1 through 6 are largely about the world mysteriously going to crap and heroes and villains showing up to basically say, I'm here and this is my name and these are my powers and I'm here to help fight this because I'm a hero, or I'm here and I'm a villain and these are my powers, and I grudgingly have to help because my world will be destroyed even if I don't mind these heroes dying. It's just kind of like a glorified roll call of the DC universe for 6 issues, for half of this series. At this point, most of the roll call character introductions are done, and the story actually starts to move forward a little bit. It's a smaller group of key characters that slowly become more and more of the focus at this point. More recognizable characters gradually become the focus of issues 6 through 12. If only for their, well, I would say issues 6 through 12 in general are just stronger, if only for their earth-shattering events and character deaths. It's not that the story becomes much more compelling, but like the events become more major and notable. And also, Peter, you're going to be a big Flash fan, which just means that this story is freaking plain unmissable from here going forward. And as a great example of this thing really starting to breathe, you know, we've got this massive showdown where, like, these major characters like Superman of Earth 2, Supergirl, Superman of Earth 1, Wonder Woman, Captain Atom, who has a very different look and costume than he did just a few years after this, Captain Marvel, the original Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, Firestorm. So lots of these major characters are coming to the antimatter universe to do battle with the Anti-Monitor. And for the first time on pages 196 and 197, there's this massive splash page that has not been done before. I mean, prior to this, there were so many panels on each page and so much dialogue and text crammed into each of those panels. Finally, it's starting to breathe a little bit, and this is actually a really cool visual. I think that the design of the weird gray, rocky environment that looks kind of naturally grown, but at the same time built in buildings that are crumbled or growing out of the rock or something. And in the background, you've got this black space, and all the stars that fill the sky are like red or pink, you know. So it's just kind of got this striking look to it that still holds up for me today. I still really enjoy looking at that splash page. Now, as I said, there are going to be spoilers, and here's one of the big ones. Supergirl dies. And on page 209, we've got her dying words that really, I think, represent, well, the transition into a post-Christian American culture. I mean, she still uses the expression, heaven knows, which, heaven knows, I've tried da-da-da-da, you know. Let me just read some of this here. She sees Superman get wounded by the Anti-Monitor, and she, like, comes to fight and protect her cousin, and she's like, he'll be alive, he has to be, but if he's not, I swear I'll carry on for him. These are thought bubbles, by the way. I may never be as good as he is, but Cal always taught me to do my best. Nothing else matters. Be true to yourself. Be the best you are able to. Don't ever give anything but your best. I've lived with this ideal, and heaven knows I've tried my hardest to live up to it, and I think for the most part I have. These are all, like, crammed into arguably one panel. You could maybe say 3 because there's panels within panels and stuff, but these are all the thoughts that are racing through her mind as she is on this massive collision course to slam into the Anti-Monitor. It's weird. It's weird to me. And multiple times they're really trying to give her the hero's death, because on 207 she sees that her cousin's in trouble, and the narration boxes read, and Supergirl rushes ahead, knowing full well that whatever could bring such pain to her powerful cousin could certainly destroy her. But Supergirl is a hero, and her concerns are not for herself, but for the one she loves. And that is, like, restated I don't know how many times. She's, like, punching the Anti-Monitor again and again, and Dr. Light is this kind of super villain that's kind of becoming a superhero. She's watching this happen, and she says, Supergirl doesn't stop. She keeps hitting him, fighting him, as if she doesn't care about herself at all. And then on the next page, she's still pummeling the anti-monitor. Dr. Light is still watching and says, she is a hero, totally selfless and concerned only with others, while I have wasted away my life with selfishness. No more, Supergirl, no more. Whatever happens here, you've shown me the truth. Oh, man. So anyway, it feels like a really heavy-handed attempt to give her the hero's death, but she does say some interesting things in there, you know, like she says heaven knows, which is an interesting kind of like smell of cultural Christianity, but she also has this bit about being true to yourself as a motto, and that's the thing that she's lived by, you know, and that has certainly survived today as like a motto that many people hold as like a high value. You got to be true to yourself. I'm just being true to myself, you know. And it's really a weird expression. I mean, being authentic is good if that's what it means. We shouldn't be fake with each other, but should we not aspire to change from who we are and be different and better than who we are today? Should like a serial killer just be true to themselves? Anyway, there are little bits of like philosophical value statements being made throughout this series, dealing with things like the morality of killing and when it's right or not right to kill someone. But the writing style is so melodramatic that it doesn't really stick, I don't think, and likely won't get today's readers thinking at all about these kinds of things as moral issues. Now, after the issues dealing with the final fates of Supergirl and the Flash, you can start skimming until you see panels that start to get a little bigger again. That's when the story events are actually starting to happen once more. The rest is mostly more character roll calls and side conflicts that don't affect the forward motion of the overall story. It's right around page maybe 278 when the Spectre appears. That's when you can start paying attention again. He's got this great entrance where he's stopping the anti-monitor just when it looks like the anti-monitor is unstoppable. You bring in the Spectre, of course, the agent of God's wrath, to do battle with this seemingly omnipotent foe. And on 295, he's like, the Spectre is not only using his own powers, whatever their level might be, but he's also channeling powers from like all these mystical characters of the DC universe. The description reads, the energy explodes inside him. It rips through his being, into his mind, through each and every atom. Well, I don't know if he's a spiritual, non-tangible being. I don't know if he has atoms. But anyway, the Spectre screams in pain. He is a funnel, a conduit. More energy pours into him. More power funnels through him. He sees worlds that have never existed and never will. He sees shapes and colors and patterns, and then in bold, and concepts undreamt of even by his master. Well, that's interesting. That, I think, kind of betrays a very limited view of God. First off, we arguably could say, okay, well, undreamt of. Well, does God dream? That's kind of a verby type thing. Does God have sequential thoughts limited to time, or does he just know, intrinsic to his being, all truths? Or at least propositional truths, I don't know, that's a philosophical discussion. But even setting that aside, if God is all-knowing, that means he's going to know all future thoughts of all beings. So if the Spectre was at one time eventually going to see shapes and colors and patterns and concepts, then God would have foreknown what those concepts and thoughts were. So it's a limited view of God that also kind of like restricts him temporally. And I think what the writer's doing is not necessarily trying to make, kind of theological statements. I think he's just searching for, this is a speculation on my part, searching for just big language that can describe these moments that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. I mean, this is such an epic story and concept that you have to really kind of inflate the language so that it can continue, the stakes can continue to be raised and be bigger and more epic and stuff. Problem is, when you go that route, eventually words are going to fail and you're going to start saying things that are nonsensical. So after that big knockdown, drag-out fight between the Anti-Monitor and the Spectre, we have the merging of the 5 parallel worlds that still existed at that point. There were like thousands, and they all got whittled down over the course of the first 6 issues or whatever. And then we've only got the 5 left. Big knockdown, drag-out battle, and blah, 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 blah. Sci-fi, techno-babble. There's only 1 left, and these 5 parallel universes have been merged into a single continuity, with certain elements being deleted and others crammed together to make one single continuity. The problem with that is that there are characters who cease to exist. In fact, they cease to have ever existed. Their entire timeline has been wiped out. But some characters still live that were at the dawn of time with this big knockdown, drag-out fight between the Anti-Monitor and the Spectre. So you've got a situation where, say, for example, and this is the key example here, the Superman of Earth 2, and that's the Superman that represents Superman starting to exist as a character in the late 30s. And so by 1985, he had, like, gray temples and stuff. So this is the original Superman. His Lois is gone. He's the Earth 2 Superman. By this time, he was kind of like relegated to like a secondary version of Superman, and they had a few years before brought this younger version of Superman, which we would probably consider to be our current Superman. But we got this Earth 2, which arguably should be called Earth 1 Superman. Earth 2 Superman survives this merging of universes, but Lois does not. And so there's a moment where he expresses his grief, but the problem is it's so crunched and melodramatic on page 312. He's just bursting into the air, just raging against the sky, and says, "But my wife, my Lois, she's gone, never was. No, this is unfair. Why was I kept alive when Lois vanished? Why did I go back in time instead of staying here, instead of entering oblivion with my wife?" So it's all just a little bit too talky, where I think in a comic book today, they wouldn't necessarily go all the way to portraying it in the way you would in a movie, which if this was happening in a movie, if they did a movie about this, I think he would maybe scream and cry and collapse, but he would do a lot less talking, So there's just a whole lot of talking going on in portraying these kinds of things in a way that just kind of feels detached and melodramatic. Now, after all these continuities merge, things do start to slow down again, unfortunately. There's some more roll-calling going on and some new status quos getting established, including like some subplot setups that are presumably resolved in individual hero titles after this event series is done. Like on page 316, Dr. Fate is talking to the character Amethyst, who something happens to her, she becomes blind, and he's trying to help her, and he says, "By the fates," as he looks into her eyes, "what is it I see in you? It is impossible." And then there's no more talk about that at all. So I'm guessing maybe there was a series called Dr. Fate and Amethyst after this that picked up that thread and kept running with it. So there's little bits like that that's just kind of like clogging things up for a modern reading of this today, which is a little bit unfortunate. It's also still inconsistent when all is said and done in terms of what memories and continuities of parallel Earths actually carry over into the single continuity that remains when Crisis on Infinite Earths is done. For example, Lex Luthor, after the merge of universes, is seen in one of these final issues of Crisis on Infinite Earths as fully bald and physically fit, but in prison. But his new status quo in DC Comics, very soon after Crisis on Infinite Earths finished being published, is that of a fat CEO who is mostly bald or balding, but still has some red hair and is definitely not in prison, but is instead this untouchable corporate businessman. And I don't know of any explanation for why he was one way after the merge of all the universes in the pages of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then something very different when we see him again just a little bit later in mainstream DC Superman stories. On the first page of the final issue, they finally seem to figure out a better way to quickly introduce characters without having them talk about themselves and, expositionally refer to themselves in the third person. They're using more like of these kind of like little boxes that just give a quick description of their name, and their powers, or their name, and what they're from, or what they're known for, or whatever, And I really wish they would have done that earlier, but okay, it was a different time. I haven't commented up to this point. I haven't talked about the story much, and I do plan to do that more in future essential issues segments, but there's not much story to talk about. That's the thing. I mean, there are things that happen, but it's not much of, it's certainly not like very character driven. It's not the type of story I'm usually going to have all kinds of things to talk about. It's a weird animal. So forgive me if this is a little bit, you're waiting for me to talk more about, well, what happened in the story? Well, not a lot happens in this story. Just like it's like a big disaster movie, and everyone's just running around trying to survive, and then you get a little bit of story here and there. Let's see here. The Anti-Monitor, on the subject of story, is, I think, the most powerful villain the DC Universe has ever faced. Probably the most powerful villain they will ever face, unless things inflate to like a crazy, complicated multiverse again, and they got to clean it up and need a villain to do the job. So he's the most powerful villain of the DC Universe history, but still really just an embodiment of evil. He's a plot device. He's an epic threat as a plot device, and seemingly unstoppable, but he's not a character with any interesting motives, so that's a little unfortunate. Thankfully, though, for my taste, he does have a cool look. So I don't know I don't know if that fixes it doesn't fix the problem, but it's nice. On 338, we've got a touch of relativism, which is really required to make diverse power sources work. If you've got a bunch of mystical characters and they're all coming from different, they're all taking inspiration from different world religions or philosophies and stuff like that, you get them all in the same room, you got to figure out, okay, well, which one of these is true? Because if you go to the source material that these things are based on, the truth, the real world religions or philosophies or whatever, they all contain truth claims that in some way, at some point, are exclusive and rule out the truth of some other system of belief. And yet, when you bring them together in a story like this, they're all doing the humana, putting their hands out and making their mystic powers work. One of the mystical characters, as they're joining their powers, says, "All pleas for success are welcome, Johnny Thunder," referring to prayer. "I, who deal with arcane arts of sorcery, understand the need for such prayers and incantations." Yeah, okay, well, prayers, incantations, whatever you got. We're going to pool it all together somehow. It then says, "The incantation they make is a silent one, each calling on his own source of power, each summoning his own beliefs. And acting as the nexus, the link between all, are Dr. Occult and Green Lantern." So yeah, it's all just spiritual, mystical energy, and we're just going to throw it in the same pot and have Dr. Occult and Green Lantern manage that. And I should add, it's the original Earth 2 Green Lantern Alan Scott, who was more of a mystical character than the sci-fi, Hal Jordan idea. Closing in on the end here, page 341, we see Wally West come across the costume of Barry Allen, the Flash, and realizing that he is dead. A little bit more melodramatic stuff. A character shows him the ring that the Flash keeps his costume in and says, "A ring with some sort of lightning insignia on it. Does this mean anything to you?" And Wally says, "His Flash ring, where he kept his universe until kept his uniform. Who knows, with a story like this? Where he kept his uniform until he needed it. It really is over now, isn't it? Oh, Lord Barry, I'll miss you. Oh, how I'll miss you." I don't know how to read that and make it sound grounded in reality at all. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that you got to put up with if you're going to read this story. But I think the reason for a lot of that was that the target audience at this time for comics was still primarily children and teenagers. It wasn't until, a decade or two later that it really became much more of like a young adult and an aging adult kind of medium that is still aiming to get kids too, but I would say most comic book readers are grown men. They're like in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and older. So given that fact, given the audience that they were aiming for at this time, it's actually pretty impressive that they dealt with as much death and darkness as they did in this story. Now on page 360, there's a pivotal moment that I think was just intended to be a sweet epilogue for a few characters, but it's actually foundational to a major DC event that would be published decades later called Infinite Crisis, which serves as a sort of sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, and I'm definitely going to be featuring that at some point in my Essential Issues series. But what we have here is Superman of Earth 2 stayed behind to fight Antimatter when everyone else basically had to leave this collapsing antimatter universe. Along with him is Superboy Prime, who was briefly introduced to the DC universe right before Crisis on Infinite Earths. He's basically just a kid from a world that's just like ours, and he discovers that he is like, I don't remember the gist of it. I think he discovers that he has superpowers. Like, he's reading Superman comic books, and then he realizes he has powers like Superman or something. I don't know. But he's basically Superboy, and on a planet where there are no other superheroes. But he finds his way into this whole conflict, and so that's all you really need to know about him. So Superboy Prime from Earth Prime is also here at the end with Alexander Luthor from Earth 3. That's a whole thing that you can learn about Alexander Luthor if you really want to by reading Crisis on Infinite Earths. Anyway, so Antimatter is defeated. Superman of Earth 2 is like, but what am I supposed to do? I'm just ready to die now because I lost my Lois. Well, Alexander Luthor shows up, and he's, Mr. I have the power that any power the writers want to give me, I can have. And so he shows up and says, hey, I actually saved Lois right before the merging of the continuities. And so here, now you can come and be with me. I'll take you to a safe place. Lois, coming out of him, says to Superman of Earth 2, I was inside him, Clark, in a place that was so beautiful. Alexander Luthor says, I can't take you back to Earth, but I am a tunnel into that other place. Come into me. We will all go there. We can, and then Clark says, we can be together always. She says, I want to be wherever you are. I'm coming too. Better to go into the unknown than die here alone, says Superboy Prime. And then Alexander Luthor says, do not worry, young Superboy. Where we go now, there will be no fear, only peace. Everlasting peace. And so I think it's supposed to be giving off kind of like this heaven vibe, this is kind of like the way we can see them dying without really seeing them dying, and they've gone off to eternal peace and stuff. And it is kind of interesting. It's like, well, how does Alexander Luthor have access to wherever this place is? Is this place heaven? I think they just wanted to stay away from those things and just be really vague about it. I get it. But what's interesting is that although this is supposed to be this kind of bittersweet closure to the original Superman, who's been around since 1938, it actually, this whole plot point, this little teeny closing bit, it actually becomes the premise for Infinite Crisis, which again would be published decades later, and they take this in a very different direction, which I found really interesting, and that made more sense than this moment did here. So anyway, that's definitely something that's noteworthy. Finally, on page 362, we have the origin of Wally West, Kid Flash, going from Kid Flash to The Flash. This was something that, as a Flash fan, when I came on board with The Flash, it was already Wally West. I'd heard about Barry Allen. I was watching the TV show. I was like, this is Barry Allen. Who's this Wally West guy? What the crap is... He used to be Kid Flash? How did he become Flash? Where's Barry Allen? So, there's just some major changes that happened, especially in the Flash continuity, that happened here in Crisis on Infinite Earths. And so reading this story just answers those questions. You're just seeing in this story... some major changes in DC continuity. This story was conceived before, but not published before, the big Marvel crossover event, which I think was called Secret Wars or Secret War. I can't remember. There was one that later was one or the other, and then there was one that was published just before Crisis on Infinite Earths. This series was announced well before Secret Wars, but it took them 4 or 5 years to do all the research required in order to make this story happen. It was much more complex. From a publishing standpoint, it was so much more of an achievement than, say, the Marvel crossover story, or any crossover story that's taken place since then, whether in the DC universe or elsewhere. I think part of the key to enjoying this today is to read it while trying to place yourself in the mid-'80s mentally, trying to place yourself there. A crossover on this scale had never been done before in comics, or had these kinds of massive effects on continuity that are constantly referred back to, for decades afterward. DC at this point, in the years leading up to this Crisis on Infinite Earths event, had purchased various properties from failing publishing comic book companies, and they'd created divergent timelines to explain how these characters, like the Captain Marvel characters and Blue Beetle and stuff, were suddenly interacting with DC characters. So they came up with the idea of these multiple universes in order to explain how they were accumulating this mess of characters from other companies, and so there were all these parallel realities for fans to try to keep track of. It was a nightmare to try and introduce new fans to the DC universe at this time. So this was an event that was basically DC cleaning house, and doing so with a number of brutal, shocking decisions about who would live, who would die, and what continuity would be changed forever. It's a major piece of not just DC continuity history, but comic book publishing history. Maybe starting with this story as you're diving into the DC universe isn't the best idea. But Pater, as you get deeper into the major events of the DC universe, this story will increasingly be referred to. It will only be a matter of time before your curiosity becomes great enough that you're really going to want to read Crisis on Infinite Earths. Okay, well at this point, as I'm recording, you can get the digitally recolored trade paperback of the entire Crisis on Infinite Earths 12-issue series for about $24 new, and that does include shipping, or as low as about $8 used, which also includes shipping in that. So there you have it. That's it for now. Stay tuned, as on the next Essential Issues, I'll be talking about an essential DC Comics story that I still like to sit down and read today. In the meantime, you're invited to join us on the forums over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth.
christiangeekcentral.com